two quick things I wanted to add for your better use of Lightroom. When you are starting, say, with this photograph, and you turn it to black and white, I've made a couple copies here, and crop, you may find that you still have work to do. First of all, again, in the other video I do mention opening up the shadows, perhaps bringing down the contrast so you have a little bit more detail. And if you need to make things brighter, you can also play with the blacks if you need to make things a little bit darker. However, for controls around smaller areas, one of the things you may want to consider is the radial gradient. Even with this, you can see how there's still a fair amount of darkness here in the fingers that may make it difficult for you to see what you're going to draw. It's relatively easy to zoom in on the screen and make it larger. You won't be able to do that in the print. And the print tends to come out a little bit darker than the screen version. What a radial gradient does is allow you to select an area and make changes. If you just select an area, it's going to change the area outside that circle. So you need to go down and select invert so that the change can happen within the circle, where you can make things a little bit brighter, open up the shadows, and give yourself enough texture and detail. Perhaps the highlights can come down a little bit so that you can see what you need to be able to draw. These radial gradients can be rotated, can be resized. It can also be applied in a more gradual or a more severe cutoff at the edge of the circle. So it depends on how you need to apply that. Sometimes you need it to fade in so that it fits with the rest of the image. You can apply more than one of these. You may decide down here that these grapes are difficult to see against a similarly toned backdrop, and you can select another radial gradient. Again, you need to go down and select invert, and then you might decide that the highlights, the whites, maybe the exposure, but I think mostly just the whites and highlights to bring the lighter parts up. We do have a little bit of an issue with this little grape down there. We can open the shadows up a squidge. And you may see that sort of change in, oops, it made an extra. You can always go back in, reselect on the dot, and move things around a little bit. So as you can see, my two changes, apply, give me the slightly lighter grapes here and the slightly lighter shadow in the hand here. The other thing you may want to consider as a value adjustment, if you scroll down to effects, right? Oops, effects, you will toggle that. And then this top one, if you move it to the left, you can create a vignette. If you move it to the right, it can fade to white. Now I've cropped this fairly tightly, so I don't necessarily may want it to go dark, but I don't want it to be necessarily a big circle. So that control is the next slider down. Will let you fade in or fade out where that midpoint on that circle is. So that is one option, and you can round it out or keep it a little more oval. And again, feathering, how gradually you want that to be applied. So those are some additional tools that you have. You may also find that once you bring the corners down, it looks a little bit darker, and that you then want to go back to your overall maybe exposure and just brighten that up a little bit, another 5%, 10%, something like that. So that you are going, again, from that to this kind of control where you can really see what you need. So radial gradient and overall vignetting are two tools that I would highly recommend, and definitely adjust these initial basic controls for your shadows, your highlights, your contrast, your whites, your blacks. You need to be able to see how that's looking. You can't just print out something gray and have a successful photo reference to draw from. So good luck, use the tools, experiment, make copies, make virtual copies so that you can have different versions of things, right? There's a before and an after in terms of control. Don't assume that the photo has to be the way it is. You have controls over everything. Enjoy.